Okay. Cool. Hello. Nice to meet you all. You're all very chirpy for mornings. Good job. I hate mornings, but I'm here. I'm excited. This is a good morning. This is a good start to the day. So, before I begin, I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri country, that we are in a country that has some of the oldest storytelling cultures in the world, and also mention that those storytelling cultures are still alive and vibrant. And this photo is Hannah Donnelly, Naika Gorry, and Alison Whitaker at the Emerging Writers Festival last year. These are three women that you should look up and listen to. These are some of the future voices of our Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices. So, hi. Jeremy's already introduced me, but just to cover a little bit about what I do, as well as starting at the Emerging Writers Festival as the Artistic Director and co-CEO, I also produce podcasts. I'm a poet, a playwright, and a broadcaster. I feel like this is a little bit loud. Is that better? No, not too loud. Good. So in terms of an artistic director and co-CEO, like, what does that mean? Artistic director is kind of a really nebulous term that for me at least, that I'm getting used to. I'm really surprised still, I only started like 2 months ago, that my job is basically to think and talk and read. Like I'll finish a day and be like, oh my God, I just spent today like researching artists all day and what did I even do? And then I'm like, oh, that's my job, great. And co-CEO is like, I'm fiscally responsible for a small to medium arts org, so that's fun. So, you think you're a writer? Well, actually, no, a lot of people don't. And this is a conversation that I am constantly having with people who I would consider to be writers. So even only the other day, my friend who is a poet and a comics illustrator told me, like, I was having this conversation being like, when was the moment that you kind of thought you were a writer? Because that's always a really interesting story for me. When are people comfortable enough calling themselves a writer? And she said, I still don't. I was like, but you've been doing it for like 10 years. And she's like, yeah, but So this is really common in the industry as imposter syndrome, etc. But I think there's a few other things like below that as well. So one story which I constantly bring up, which is, I don't know, maybe a sign that it's like damaged my psyche in some way, is that I was, at a house party, having a glass of very cheap and disgusting red, classic poet, and I struck up a conversation with a man I hadn't met before. He said, so what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a writer. And he said, oh, so you're published then? Have I read your work? Oh, so do you pay your rent with that? And I was like, ooh, okay, well, firstly, yes, and secondly, yes, but why are those the questions that you asked? Rather than, awesome, what is your work interested in? Or, cool, like what form? Right, oh, you're a playwright, what sort do you, like what's your process like? The questions were really centered on these kind of like practical indicators. And I think that that's, I'm going to talk a little bit more about like the state of the arts in general, particularly in the literary sector, but I think that's really indicative of the kind of the problem that I have with the word literature in the first place and the difficulty of who gets to be called a writer. And that's kind of the central question for me in what I'll be talking about today. Literature, think about that word for a moment. Sounds like kind of the realm of like dead white men a lot of the time. So how can we look at that concept again and consider other forms of storytelling? How can we look at literature and, think of it as being something that a lot more people can access? And what are those barriers to access as well? So I've got this, caveat. A lot of my slides are quotes by writers I like. Basically, I've got enough in here to start my own little like Tumblr of writers' quotes. There's only one of them smoking a cigarette looking sultry, but that's still pretty good. So anyway, like this is good. Backdrop. Mira Gonzalez is a writer and kind of was really central to alt-lit. I don't know if you guys remember that time on the internet. Alt-lit is dead is basically what I would say now, but it was a kind of a movement of writers connecting over the internet and talking about and interrogating what it means to write and what is considered writing. So a lot of that would be, you might have seen kind of like, you know, it'd be like a photo of like a house with some kind of like text that wasn't particularly well edited about like what home means or something like that. So this kind of like memes, writing with images. Often what characterized alt-lit as well was like a particular kind of like a lack of punctuation, a lack of capital letters, looking at the ways that we communicate on the internet and, you know, transferring that into a writing practice. So it was very hard when that was a thing as well to consider like what was good alternative literature. It was like, there was not an easy way to put your finger on it. But what I really loved about this movement was people like Mira speaking about this idea of no longer an alternative literature, but an alternative to literature. And that's an idea that I find really interesting. So kind of looking at the entrenched power structures of, if you look at literature again as what this dude at the house party said, so you get paid and where are you published? So looking at literature through the narrow lens of like books and publication and kind of existing cultural institutions. So what else can we do with digital spaces that, you know, questions and interrogates that one narrow definition of what it means to be a writer or what it means to be literary? I kind of, this talk goes on like a bit of a nice journey about who can be a writer. But before I go into that like fun time, I also was like, there's some things that are not great about the literary sector. So this top stat that Australian authors earn about $12,900 on average annually. That's Australian authors. So I'm talking people who are who have published books, who are in contention for the Miles Franklin, Stella Prize winners. Often people who win those sorts of literary prizes are like, oh my God, what a relief. Now I have enough money to support myself for another year to keep writing. You know, and these are some of our greatest storytellers. These are the people that we look to for, you know, questions and answers about how we live our lives, about what it means to be, you know, an Australian in the world, and what sorts of things are happening within our country. So that's a bit depressing. That's stats from 2015, and from what I hear as well, it's actually gone downwards. Cuts to arts funding in the sector as well can be a really depressing thought. They particularly impacted small to medium arts organisations and particularly young and emerging writers or storytellers, which is really bad as well, because how do you get a literary future if people just give up? Writing sometimes feels like the Hunger Games, you know? You kind of like, if you just last longer, then maybe you'll be successful. But you know, on that note as well, just to take that metaphor even further, you have a better chance if you team up with someone. So like, find your community. That's why writers' festivals are important. And then the last one there as well is, I guess, a huge barrier to access to culture from both the perspective of programmers and producers, as well as artists and creators, is the culture of unpaid work and internships. So that means that there's kind of entrenched inequality, both from a kind of social and class perspective, but also particular groups that are more likely to, you know, have concurrent social and class mobility kind of issues, I suppose. So that can also, I feel like this is very strongly linked to a lack of diversity in the arts as well. That word is problematic in some ways, but I guess what I would say with that is maybe like, the perspectives aren't always that different when, you know, you create a very particular work environment or a very particular model of success. That means only a particular type of person can succeed. Okay, but it's not all depressing. all the time. So this is a quote from Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark, which has just been republished, I think in no small part because of Trump's election. So this in particular, I really love that inside the word emergency is emerge. So, you know, there's good things that can still come. And Solnit makes these fantastic points in basically central to her thesis, is that pessimism and optimism lead to inaction a lot of the time. If you think everything's going to be fine, why would you do anything? If you think you can't, like everything's going to be terrible no matter what would you do, why would you do anything? So hope is really central and really important in order to make change happen. If you believe that you can make change, that is when you're going to have a crack at it. And this is circling back to literature again, where I think the importance of that storytelling comes out in this particular climate. So despite all of the sort of things that I stated on the last slide, I think that storytellers have the ability to inspire action and to create that kind of hope to drive us all. Whoop, too far. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different forms of storytelling, just in order to I want to break down this concept of what literature is and what it means to be like a writer. I feel like you're all probably very much across this sort of thing and on board with it, and probably there's like a wide range of storytellers in this room, which is exciting. Hello. So this photo too is a tape party, which is the thing that people used to do when, like, you know, recording technology was a relatively new and exciting thing. Like, I don't know, would we all still do this with our iPhones? Like, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, so these guys are having a slumber party and they're recording something cool. Yeah, but so talking about oral storytelling, I wanted to bring up Rosalind Oates, who's a really fascinating Melbourne theatre maker, and her process is that she edits scripts in sound, so she doesn't write down any of what she makes, and she uses audio cued scripts for her actors. So if you were performing in one of Rosalind's shows, you would have on a headset, and you would be hearing the words that you were meant to say, and then you would speak them as you hear them. So that also lends this like really interesting air of immediacy to those performances, because the actors are focusing on like the way that those words are being said rather than just the words themselves. So there's a lot more that, like, I guess you can capture a lot more in a sound print. So and specifically as well, she makes verbatim like documentary theatre. So she did this fantastic example in a talk that I saw her do about her process, where she put on her headset and was listening to a track, and it was like a 50-year-old British boxer, and she is a very petite, like, Australian woman, and she was acting this character, like listening to his speech and kind of following his cadence and rhythm and accent. So it's a really interesting process, and it comes out with such a different result. And that's just because she's writing with sound for theatre, specifically, rather than writing with words for the stage. So I guess, I don't know, there's something I feel like there's a lot we can learn about that. Like, even, I'm sure that a lot of people can relate to the differences in, you know, speech versus writing. Like, if I was reading from a script that I'd written down, I know that my written language is slightly different to my off-the-cuff spoken language. And, you know, even interrogating those little differences and those nuances in your practice, sometimes it is better to just talk into your phone or a recorder and then go off and script something. It's, you know, it can make a real difference. And then podcasting, I will touch on very briefly, but you know, it's booming at the moment. I'm sure everyone's aware of this. There actually are like a lot of really good Australian podcasts out there. People seem to not know where to find them because of the marketing from America. And they're very good too, but we have some really good Australian ones. So one that I make is Systeria, which is like a feminist arts and culture podcast. If that's your jam, listen to it. There's also things like All the Best, which is a documentary podcast. And that's, made by independent producers, a lot of whom are learning, and they're very good at what they do. It's beautiful, creative audio, sort of kind of in the vein of This American Life, if you like that sort of thing. There's a couple of really good ones that have come out of the Wheeler Center. The Andrew Denton one about death, whose name I can't remember right now. The Messenger podcast, which is a collaboration between Michael Green, a Melbourne journalist, and Aziz Abdul Muhammad, who is in detention on Nauru. So these sorts of storytelling things in Australia are really happening. And that's a really interesting one for me as well, because podcasters often, don't consider themselves writers, whereas I would see that as a form of writing with sound. And the amount of scripting and tape that goes into a podcast is wild. Poetry is another one that I'd bring up. Obviously that is within the purview of literature, but there's something that a lot of people, poetry came from song. It's kind of its roots are in song and the spoken word. And it's something, there's this, I never say his name right, so Borges. Can anyone say that better than I can? No. Borges, give it a go. No. Thank you. Much better. I will practice that again. Has a fantastic quote about poetry, which is, he's basically like, if you don't feel compelled to read this out, then it's not good poetry. And poetry occupies a weird space in the Australian kind of literary community, where a lot of people see that as very elitist and inaccessible, which I think is really sad, because, and there's so many different forms as well. Spoken word poetry has obviously gained a much bigger foothold in Australia in the last 10 years or so. It's a form of storytelling as well that is strongly linked to politics and social change. So, I don't know, and we have this kind of explosion of amazing upcoming or emerging Australian poets at the moment. So it's really worth having a look at. Everyone go and read Omar Saker. That's my recommend if you need some Australian poetry. So that's one. I also want to point to something that, again, doesn't necessarily always get included in this category of literature in Australia, which is our history of oral storytelling tradition. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we live in a place that has some of the oldest storytelling cultures in the world. That's amazing. So Black and Bright, which is the Victorian Indigenous Literary Festival, ran a program that was called Borrow a Rare Living Book. And this was where you could go and sort of borrow an elder for 10 minutes, and they would yarn with you and tell you a story. That's absolutely invaluable, and that's something that's not communicated through, our initial view of literature as just being written words on a page to be consumed in a particular way. I'm really excited actually as well about future potential of podcasting interacting with our oral storytelling traditions. As far as I know, no one's doing heaps with it yet, apart from some, broadcasting places like Karma and Alice Springs, but I think that that's got a really thrilling future potential in Australia. Somebody do that, please. Digital storytelling. I brought up alt-lit before, but there's, obviously a lot of kind of huge potential in the internet, if only because so different to the written page, you've got, it's like three-dimensional, it's space almost. So I just wanted to briefly mention the Digital Writers Festival, which is, so I actually technically direct two festivals. So there's the Emerging Writers Festival in June, which is the kind of physical, temporal one in Melbourne, and then the Digital Writers Festival is at the end of October. And that is exactly what it sounds like, a Digital Writers Festival. I'm kind of starting planning for that at the moment. If anyone has any good ideas, please come and talk to me. That is a space where I want to start to deconstruct what a writers' festival can be. I don't want it to just be, you shouldn't be just live streaming a panel. If we were going to do that, that can be part of the Emerging Writers Festival. It doesn't need to be a specifically digital writers festival. So I'm interested in what exists in that space, what's different about that space, and starting to deconstruct it as well. I think one thing about speaking about literature and that kind of idea of literature as kind of a canon and all of these sorts of associations we take to it, and breaking that apart too. The way that that's interacted with writers' festivals a lot of the time is that there's kind of a university model, if you will. So this, like where I speak to you and you sit there as an audience and you listen. And maybe there would be an opportunity for questions. So that's a lecture format. Or perhaps the format would be, that Jeremy and I would do an in-conversation, or then we'd pull someone else up and there'd be a panel. So that's still a fairly limited range of events, though, for different learning styles that can be really difficult to interact with. So I think there's a lot of potential in a digital writers festival, and also hopefully in, further emerging writers festivals to deconstruct that and start to think about different ways of communicating content, and whether that's even just that the content itself is the primacy, like the main important thing. I do not have heaps of time left. I wanted to mention Ross Onley-Zirkle as well, because he is a Melbourne writer, and he writes in Auslan and interprets into English, which, again, just in terms of, and so digital storytelling, the reason he's under this is because he communicates, like, his writing is in video form most of the time. Understandably, because Auslan you need to see. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I thought that was a really interesting thought, again, in terms of just communicating in a visual language and then translating into, the written word. I thought was really fascinating. Another question that comes up when we speak about digital storytelling, which I don't think the conversation has quite reached this point yet, but is going to be a really interesting question for the future, is conservation and archiving in the digital age. So we're already seeing things where, and this is affecting writers in very particular ways. If you wrote for a website, let's say, I think it's Oyster or is it Yen? There's a couple of, there's spaces that will fold, right? Or, and like particular magazines that are online. When that happens, what happens to your work if you've been published there? Does the website disappear? At the same time, we have this kind of expectation that the internet remembers everything. How does that change the work that you put up online? Which are all really interesting questions that hopefully we'll explore at DWF. I wanted to look at this concept as well of storytelling as survival in terms of looking at, literature, again, outside of that purview of just speaking directly through books. So I've got a photo here of Melissa Broder, and I don't know if you can see it properly, but that is a coffin. This was her going coffin shopping. Very strange and funny woman. She runs the So Sad Today Twitter account, which has been turned into like a book she's written a book of essays as well. Look it up, it's really weird and great. But so this is really interesting because asking Broder about what motivates, and she's a fantastic essayist, what motivates that is kind of catharsis and mental health. She says something like, she's found a bunch of, like, so many palliatives in the world that don't work for her. Writing is the only one that's stuck. So, drug taking or like, sex and all of these ways to like feel and kind of deal with her psychic trauma, basically, and finding that writing is a mode of survival. And I think that's something that we sometimes discount. There's that telling a story in whatever process you do that can be a bigger action than just, putting words to page. Yeah, I think that'll do. Oh, this Anne Boyer essay as well on not writing. Just everyone go and read that. It's great. Okay, so also then the next point as well is storytelling as a mode of observation. Also, Susan Sontag in a bear suit. Great. Like, happy morning. So I think that one of the things that is perhaps most relevant across different forms as well as just writing is seeing storytelling as a mode of observation. So training yourself to walk down the street and pay attention to the color, the shape, the sound, the smell, use all of your senses, exercises in that don't have to have any kind of end goal other than that it's a way of seeing the world, that you start to notice, you pay attention to the other people around you. One example of that is flânerie, which is kind of a concept of, it's very strongly rooted, the initial concept, it's a French word, flâneur, very strongly rooted again in like a sort of a wealthy white man who can move freely through space and who, you know, has leisure time with which to observe the world, and walking through urban spaces and taking notes and kind of making just observational comment that then maybe tells you something about what that society is. I'm also really interested though too in the psychogeography of space. So places hold on to histories. You can observe that moving through them. Like walking itself can be an act of storytelling, and that, yeah, that's really fascinating. And also interrogating that further and being like, is it possible for like a woman to be a flâneur? What is different about moving through space as, you know, different people, and interrogating that can be a really interesting mode of social observation too. Other points that are kind of related to this, just message before medium. That's something for me working cross-form, is when I want to tell a different story, I think of what the story is before I choose the mode. And I think that's an interesting like point to raise, is like maybe if you're working on something and thinking that it's a podcast, like consider a couple of questions, which is like, why this form and why this point in time? Because those are two really vital, critical, rigorous questions in your creative practice that I think a lot of people don't ask. So, you know, what's unique to the form that you're using? And yeah, why are you making it at this point in time? And then that last question, how much tape does it take? I've just been thinking about this a lot because I've just finished listening to S-Town. And that's a really good example of going with the story, observing, taking notes, I cannot imagine how much tape went into making that podcast. But just that you might see this much of something in a story and use about this much of it. And that's okay, that's an editorial process, and that's really useful. Okay, and then finally just talking about writing or storytelling as a form of social change as well. Again, breaking free of that concept of literature as being, you know, having to be something that is published, having to be something that is, you know, within the canon. So I just put Worcestershire up here because I wanted to like give an example of like, whenever I used to teach poetry students, I'd be like, poetry can inspire social change. And that's a really good example of a poet who is very political, so she worked on, Beyonce used elements of Worcestershire's words in Lemonade, which is how most people will know her work. But then the thing is that after hearing that from, you know, like this huge cultural product, you go and look up the rest of her work. And, you know, then you're reading about, you know, like African diaspora experience of living in the UK. You're reading about war, you're reading about rape, and these are all kind of like concurrent, fantastic things that can come through different storytelling collaborations. And to reference back to Solnit again, just, I don't know, remembering that telling stories have the power to, you know, influence people and create change. And I guess there's another point here as well in terms of where we're at now. We have this unprecedented access to first-person narratives, which sometimes is overwhelming. It's like everyone's writing a memoir. Maybe that's not what we need to hear. But at the same time, being able to have access to speaking in your own voice, you know, is a huge difference. And being able to not speak for people, understand that history has more than one perspective. It's not a singular voice. There's always more than one view of what happened at any one time. We're all going to have our own experience of sitting in this room, even if we can agree what date it was, where we were, and, you know, what time Izzy kept talking till. Yeah. I just really like that quote. That's the one that's with the person smoking. What a babe. That's it. But questions, if you have time, if you have to go to work, that's okay too.